Sundar Pichai had always believed that success did not erase the need for humility. Though he lived in a home filled with glass walls, polished marble, and the quiet hum of modern luxury, he never allowed pride to rest too heavily on his shoulders. Still, even a man known for simplicity could sometimes fail to notice the hidden worlds around him. His story begins on an ordinary evening, one that at first seemed too simple to remember, but would later become impossible to forget. It was late, the soft light of the setting sun spilling through the wide windows. Sundar had just finished a long day filled with endless calls and documents. His mind was crowded with voices from around the world, but his eyes kept drifting toward the small figure moving quietly in the corner of his home. The maid, a woman who had worked silently in his house for months, seemed different that day. There was something urgent in the way she folded the cloth, something restless in her steps. He did not know why he noticed her then, but once he did, he could not look away. As the clock touched 7, she placed her tools down with a speed that suggested more than routine. Sundar, curious, watched as she packed her small worn-out bag. She checked her phone with trembling fingers, glanced around as if to make sure no one was looking, and then slipped out through the back gate. Sundar felt a strange tug in his chest. It was not suspicion, not quite. It was something heavier. The feeling that a hidden story was playing out right under his nose and he had been blind to it all this time. Almost without thinking, he stood up, put on his jacket, and followed. The streets outside were buzzing with ordinary life, the kind of life Sundar rarely touched anymore. Men sold roasted peanuts at the corner. Children played barefoot with sticks. Rickshaws rattled by with passengers who looked both tired and hopeful. Sundar walked behind the maid at a distance, his heart pounding with questions he could not yet name. What secret was she hiding? Why did her shoulders shake as if carrying an invisible burden? What truth lived in her silence that he, with all his knowledge and power, had never asked about? She turned down narrow lanes that Sundar had never walked before. Gone were the shining buildings and quiet gardens of his neighborhood. Here the air was heavy with smoke, the walls stained with years of dust and the ground uneven under his careful steps. Sundar felt out of place, like a stranger in a city he thought he knew, but he kept walking, the rhythm of her hurried steps pulling him deeper into the unknown. Then he saw it. She stopped at a broken doorway, a building barely standing, its walls cracked and its roof patched with plastic sheets. Sundar's chest tightened as he watched her push the door open and step inside. He waited, unsure, until a sound carried through the air. Laughter, light but strained, followed by a cough that shook the silence. Sundar leaned closer, peering through a small gap in the wall. What he saw froze him in place. Inside the dim room, 2 children sat on the floor, their clothes torn but their eyes shining with a joy that came only from seeing someone they loved return home. The maid dropped to her knees, hugging them tight, her face breaking into a smile that carried both love and pain. Sundar's breath caught. He had seen wealth, power, and ambition in many forms, but here was something different, something raw. The woman who cleaned his floors all day returned each evening to a life of struggle he had never imagined. Her silence at work had hidden a storm of sacrifice. As Sundar stood frozen, a small boy pointed toward the window. "Amma, someone is outside," he whispered. The maid turned, her smile fading as her eyes locked on the shadow near the wall. Sundar's heart raced. He had not expected to be seen. He had not planned what he would say. In that instant, the weight of his choice pressed down on him. He had crossed into her private world, and now there was no turning back. The maid slowly rose, her eyes wide with fear, and stepped toward the doorway. Sundar knew he could no longer remain silent. But before he could speak, a loud sound echoed from the street. A man shouting angrily, footsteps pounding closer. The children's laughter vanished, replaced by silence heavy with dread. The maid's hands trembled as she reached for the door, and Sundar realized with a chill running through him that he was about to witness something far darker than he had ever imagined. The man at the door, the voice outside grew louder, filled with anger that seemed to cut through the walls. Sundar stayed in the shadows, his breath unsteady, his mind racing with questions he had no answers to. The maid froze near the door, her eyes darting between her children and the noise coming closer. The children clung to her clothes, their little faces clouded with fear. In that moment, Sundar understood something without anyone telling him. Whoever that man was, he was not bringing peace to this house. He was bringing trouble. The door burst open with a force that shook the fragile frame. A tall man stumbled inside, his shirt half untucked, his face rough, his eyes red as if burning with both anger and shame. Sundar could smell the sharpness of alcohol even from where he hid outside. The maid did not flinch. though Sundar could see the pain in her eyes. She stood straight, placing herself between the man and the children. Her voice came out quiet, almost broken, yet steady. "Please, not in front of them," she said. The man laughed, a sound that was not joy but something bitter, something cruel. He shouted words Sundar could barely understand, words filled with blame and frustration. He accused her of working too long, of hiding money, of forgetting her place. Sundar's fists clenched by his side. This was no stranger's quarrel. It was the raw truth of survival, the kind of truth that people like him often never saw. Sundar wanted to step in, to say something, but the weight of his presence pressed on him. How could he explain why he was here? How could he reveal that he had followed her out of curiosity, and now found himself in the middle of her life's most fragile moments? The maid's voice broke through his thoughts again. She begged the man to leave, promised she would give him whatever she had but to spare the children. The little boy began to cry softly. His sister pulled him close, whispering that it would be okay even though she did not believe it herself. Sundar felt a sharp ache in his chest. He had spent years making decisions that changed the lives of millions, yet here, in this crumbling room, he felt powerless. The man grew louder, angrier, throwing a small stool across the room. The children screamed. The maid covered them with her arms, and Sundar could no longer stand still. Something in him cracked open. This was not about curiosity anymore. It was about dignity, about respect, about humanity itself. He pushed the broken door wide and stepped inside. The room fell silent. The man blinked, confused by the sudden appearance of a stranger. The maid's eyes widened in shock, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak, but no words would come. The children stared at Sundar, their tears paused by the presence of someone they had never seen but instinctively hoped might protect them. Sundar's voice came out low, calm, but carrying a weight that filled the room. "Enough," he said, his eyes fixed on the man. Not another word. For a long moment no one moved. The air was thick, charged, as if the walls themselves were waiting for what would happen next. The man's expression twisted, a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. He took one unsteady step forward, pointing at Sundar. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" he shouted, his voice trembling with more than just rage. And in that instant, Sundar knew that his decision to step inside would not only change the maid's life, it might also change his own forever. The silent storm. The man's question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and demanding. The maid stood frozen, her body trembling as she tried to shield her children. Sundar remained still, his eyes steady on the man, his voice quiet but unshaken. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence fill the room, a silence so heavy that even the children stopped sobbing for a moment. Sometimes silence has more power than words, and Sundar understood that. The man laughed, though the sound was weak, hollow. He stepped closer, his breath uneven, his hand twitching as if torn between striking and surrendering. Sundar noticed the lines on his face, the weariness in his shoulders. This was not a monster created in one night, but a man broken by years of disappointment, anger, and choices that had burned bridges instead of building them. Sundar saw the cracks beneath his rage, and strangely he felt no hate for him. What he felt was sorrow. The maid suddenly spoke, her voice shaking yet filled with a strange strength. "He is my employer," she said softly, her eyes locked on her husband. "He is the reason we eat. And if you raise your hand today, you will not only lose me, you will lose them." Her hand moved gently to the children, who clung tighter to her arms. Her words cut through the air like a truth the man had long tried to ignore. For the first time, Sundar saw hesitation in the man's eyes. But hesitation is not the same as change. His pride rose, stubborn and wild, and he spat words of anger, calling her ungrateful, accusing Sundar of shaming him. Sundar took a slow breath. He was not here to argue, he was not here to fight. He was here because something inside told him that fate had pulled him to this place for a reason. He stepped forward, just enough for his presence to fill the small room. His voice remained calm, steady, like a quiet storm that cannot be ignored. "You think strength is in shouting," Sundar said, "but strength is in restraint. You think respect is demanded, but it is earned. These children, they do not need fear. They need hope." The man's face hardened, but Sundar could see his hand lower slightly, his shoulders dropping. The maid's eyes glistened with tears, not from fear this time, but from the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something could change tonight then. Before anyone could say another word, the little girl spoke. Her voice was small, trembling, but it carried through the room. "Appa," she whispered, "please don't make Amma cry again." Those words shattered the air more than any shout could. The man froze, his chest rising and falling, his anger colliding with the innocence of his daughter's plea. Sundar felt his heart twist at the sight, the storm in the man's eyes fighting against the fragile love of a child who only wanted peace. But just as the silence began to soften, a loud knock echoed from the street outside. The sound was harsh, urgent, nothing like the earlier shouting. It was different, demanding, commanding. The maid's face turned pale, her breath caught in her throat. Sundar had never seen fear like that. She whispered only one word, barely audible yet filled with terror. Police. The knock at the door, the knock grew louder, each strike against the fragile door making the children flinch and pull closer to their mother. The maid's face had drained of color, her lips moving without sound as though she was whispering prayers only she could hear. Sundar looked at her, and for the first time he saw fear not for herself but for something greater. Something buried deeper than the man's anger or the poverty that wrapped around her life. It was the kind of fear that only appears when a secret threatens to surface. The man turned toward the door, confused, his rage momentarily broken by surprise. His drunken courage flickered, but his pride kept him standing tall. Why would they come here? He muttered, his words more to himself than anyone else. Sundar did not answer. He was too focused on the maid, who shook her head slowly, her eyes begging for something he did not yet understand. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a voice from outside. It was firm, official, and carried the weight of authority. "Open the door," the voice commanded. The children whimpered, the little boy pressing his face into his mother's sari. Sundar's heart tightened as he watched her hands tremble while she stroked their hair, trying to calm them even though her own body shook like a leaf in the wind. Sundar stepped closer to her. "What is this?" he asked quietly, careful that the man would not hear. The maid's eyes darted to his, filled with tears she had held back for too long. She shook her head again, biting her lip as if words themselves might break her completely. The man, impatient, stumbled toward the door, ready to shout at whoever dared to disturb his household. But before his hand touched the handle, the maid cried out, "Wait!" Her voice cracked through the silence, startling everyone in the room. The children gasped, Sundar's breath caught, and the man turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Don't open it," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "Please, I don't." The man frowned, suspicion creeping across his face. "What have you done?" he demanded. He took a step closer to her, his anger rekindled not by the police outside but by the fear he now saw on her face. Sundar moved slightly, placing himself in her line of protection, his eyes never leaving the man's. Outside, the voice came again, firmer, more commanding. "We know you are inside. Open the door now." The sound of boots shifted on the ground, more than one man waiting. Sundar felt the weight of time pressing down, each second stretching longer, each breath heavier. The maid closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. "They are not here for him," she said in a trembling whisper. "They are here for me." The room fell silent, even the man stunned by her words. Sundar's mind raced. For her? Why would the police come for her? She who spent her days quietly working, humbly cleaning, sacrificing for her children. What truth was hidden in her silence? What past had followed her to this crumbling home? The knock came once more, louder than before, and the door shook under its force. The maid opened her eyes, looked straight at Sundar, and said with a broken voice, "If they take me, promise you will protect my children." The truth at the threshold. The words fell from her lips like stones sinking into deep water. Sundar stood frozen, her request echoing inside his mind. "Promise you will protect my children." It was not a plea meant for a neighbor or a friend. It was a mother's desperate cry spoken to the one person she had never expected to be here. Sundar felt the children's wide eyes on him, searching for safety, searching for an answer he was not sure he could give. His throat tightened, but he nodded slowly, a silent vow that burned heavier than anything he had carried in his professional life. The man staggered back, his confusion growing darker by the second. "What have you done?" he hissed, his voice sharp with suspicion. His pride bristled at the thought that the police had come not for him but for her. His anger, once wild and uncontrolled, now folded into fear of the unknown. The maid did not answer him. She kept her gaze on Sundar, as if placing every fragment of hope she had left into his hands. Outside, the knocking grew impatient, now joined by the sound of a heavy fist slamming against the thin wood. "Open this door!" the voice barked. The children cried louder, their little hands gripping tightly onto their mother's clothes. Sundar's heart ached at the sight. He had seen numbers rise and fall on screens, had witnessed decisions shake markets and nations, but nothing had ever felt as raw and urgent as two children clutching their mother, afraid she would be taken away. The maid finally spoke, her voice soft, trembling but steady enough to break through the chaos. Years ago, she whispered, I made a choice I thought would save my family, but that choice has been following me, waiting for this day. Her words were fragments, broken pieces of a story too heavy to tell in one breath. Sundar leaned closer, his curiosity battling with the weight of the moment. What choice? What had she carried silently all this time? The man's face twisted with rage and disbelief. You've disgraced us, he shouted, though his voice cracked, betraying his fear. You're the reason they're here. He lunged forward as if to grab her arm, but Sundar stepped between them without hesitation. His presence, tall and unmoving, stopped the man in his tracks. Sundar's eyes were calm but firm, a silent warning that needed no explanation. The room was a battlefield of silence and fear. The children's cries softened into small hiccups of exhaustion. The maid's tears streaked down her face, and the man's pride crumbled into bitter muttering. The pounding at the door did not stop, and every strike made the fragile wood tremble as if it could give way at any second. Finally, the maid turned her face toward Sundar, her voice so quiet that only he could hear. I never told anyone, she said, but I once ran from something terrible. I thought I could bury it. I thought no one would ever find me, but they have. Sundar felt the gravity of her words sink deep into him. The world outside the door was demanding her. But here in this room her life was a secret wrapped in silence. He wanted to ask what she had done, why the police wanted her, but there was no time. The door cracked under another blow, a piece of wood splintering and falling to the ground. The maid gasped, pulling her children close, and whispered through trembling lips, When they enter, you will know the truth I've hidden all these years. The secret revealed. The last strike shattered the door, splinters scattering across the floor. The children screamed. The maid clutched them so tightly it was as if her arms alone could shield them from the world. Sundar stood firm, his eyes fixed on the figures now filling the doorway. 2 policemen entered, their uniforms heavy with authority, their faces stern, carrying the weight of official duty. The room shrank under their presence, every breath pulled thin with tension. The man staggered back, raising his hands, his voice trembling. I've done nothing, he said quickly, desperate to push away suspicion. But the policemen ignored him, their eyes locked on the maid, who knelt on the ground, her head bowed, her tears falling silently onto the children's hair. One officer stepped forward and spoke, his voice even but unyielding. We've been searching for you for a long time. Sundar's chest tightened. The maid lifted her face slowly, her eyes meeting the officer's, her voice breaking as she spoke. I know, she whispered. I thought I could hide. I thought I could make a new life. The children clung tighter, confused and terrified. Sundar bent slightly, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder, his presence a quiet promise that he had not forgotten his vow. The maid looked at him then, her eyes filled with gratitude and pain, as though she was finally letting someone see the truth she had carried alone. Her words came in fragments, but each piece struck with the weight of years. She told them she had once worked in a factory far from here, a place where voices were silenced and rules were broken. She had spoken up just once against a man who used his power to harm others. That one act of courage had put her in danger. She fled, carrying her children, believing that silence and distance would keep them safe. But silence had its limits, and the past had found her again. The room was thick with stillness after her confession. The man stood speechless, his pride collapsing into something smaller, something ashamed. The policemen exchanged glances, their stern expressions softening slightly. No longer seeing a criminal, but a woman who had carried a wound too heavy for one life. One officer spoke gently. You should have come forward. Hiding only made the burden heavier. The maid lowered her head, her tears falling freely now. I wanted to protect them, she said, her voice trembling. They are all I have. Sundar stepped forward then, his presence calm but strong. And she is not alone anymore, he said. His words were steady, filled with quiet authority, not of power but of respect. These children deserve safety. She deserves to be heard, not hunted. The officers paused, considering his words. The air was no longer thick with anger but heavy with choice. The children's small hands held onto both their mother and Sundar, as if they already knew their futures would depend on what happened in this moment. After a long silence, one officer nodded. "We will hear her story," he said softly. "This time we will listen." The tension in the room broke like a dam, replaced by an aching quiet. The maid collapsed into tears, holding her children close, her body shaking with relief and exhaustion. Sundar stood beside her, not as an employer, not as a man of wealth, but simply as a human being who had witnessed the weight of another's struggle and chosen to stand with her. As the night grew darker outside, Sundar knew that what he had seen would never leave him. The secret she carried was not just hers anymore. It was a reminder that respect, kindness, and resilience could bloom even in the harshest corners of life. And though the road ahead for her was uncertain, one truth remained clear. He would not let her walk it alone.